Good evening. My name is Paul Zients, and I'm the Dean of the College of Education here at DePaul University. For the past 12 years, the College of Education, under the leadership of Diane Horowitz, has been presenting topical forums that address the significant issues of the day. Unfortunately, we have a large number of issues from which to choose each time, and tonight's topic hits teaching at its core. How do we as individuals and how do we as teachers enable our students to better contextualize the information that's on the internet? What is the impact of our understanding the difference between facts and opinions or truly manipulative, outright misinformation? It lies at the heart of critical thinking. I am proud as Dean that we have been able to present these meetings as such each term to the DePaul and Chicagoland community. I am certain that Dr. Donovan and tonight's esteemed panelists will provide to you insight and tools to help us navigate these very difficult topics. Now what I would like to introduce is Dr. Marie Donovan, a woman who holds many titles that doesn't begin to describe her impact on our world. Dr. Donovan is an associate professor, early childhood program director, acting chair of the Department of Counseling and Special Education, and the chair of the Faculty Advisory Council of the Illinois Board of Higher Education. I am sure she will do a great job moderating this panel tonight. Marie?
Thanks, Paul, for that. You're making me blush. So welcome, everyone. We're really pleased that you've joined us for what will be a critically informative session devoted to hearing firsthand from education stakeholders about the disinformation campaigns that are targeting school boards and school personnel, as well as the effects they're having on professional and personal lives, not only livelihoods. We've designed tonight's content for you, our audience, pre-service, in-service educators here at DePaul and from other universities, concerned community members, and faculty. Truly, we're glad you could make it. Now, I want to first thank the many people who made our time together possible. Paul Zients, our dean, thanking him for his ongoing commitment to sponsoring these forums. Meredith Joya, our college's senior administrator for digital content and communication, thanking her for all the web wizardry she does that ensures we're readily and reliably connected for these events. Erin Rice, Executive Assistant to Dean Zients, and Camille Laxamana, Senior Assistant to our doctoral program, whose joint savvy organizing and logistical strategizing ensured you knew about our event and found your way here. And finally, especially, I want to thank Diane Horowitz, whose heartfelt dedication to critically and roundly examining issues in education today is boundless and inspiring to all of us who are lucky to work alongside her. Now, these forums, we hold them quarterly, as Dean Zients mentioned, and so you're going to be notified about upcoming forums that are ahead in the spring and the fall. DePaul University was founded in the name of a 17th century saint who devoted his life to serving his community. St. Vincent and his partner, St. Louis de Marillac, taught others to focus on the public good long before that phrase ever captured modern imagination. Tonight's panelists are going to lead us in examining what's happening today to the public good upon which our nation's public schools were established. Our first panelist is a licensed public school teacher, education writer, and journalism professor, Jennifer Berkshire. Ms. Berkshire is the co-author with Jack Schneider of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of School. She's also the creator and co-host of an education policy podcast, Have You Heard? Ms. Berkshire will describe the landscape of national school board disruptions and related efforts to intimidate educators. She'll identify who's behind the dismantling of public education in America, and she'll explain what's motivating them to act in these ways now. Our remaining three panelists will shift our attention from the national to the more local. We'll hear next from former U.S. history teacher and counselor and current professor and director of the labor education program at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Robert Bruno. Dr. Bruno's most recent book, A Fight for the Soul of Public Education, The Chicago Teachers' Strike, is a continuation of his decades-long scholarship in labor studies and employment policy. Dr. Bruno will share his experiences with anti-mask protests in the suburban Chicago School District, where he serves as president of its board. He'll also offer ways we can all support boards in maintaining the public good they're designed to uphold. Next, Lane Pate Peta, middle school librarian and learning center director for a suburban Chicago public school, will highlight from personal experience some various attempts at book censorship and bans and trace for us the negative effects such attempts have had, not only on the diversity of library collections, but especially upon the students for whom they're curated. Ms. Peta will draw upon her experiences in teaching high school social studies and Spanish, as well as directing a children's program in a public library, in recommending ways that educators and parents can coalesce in maintaining what she and so many others consider the most important public institution in a democracy: free and accessible libraries. Our final panelist is one of our college's very own Blue Demon Educational Leadership Program graduates, veteran public high school American Studies and government teacher and recognized curriculum author, Ms. Lindsay DiTomaso. Ms. DiTomaso will depict the attempts to stifle teaching about race and the complex history of our country at her suburban school. She'll also present suggestions for how educators should respond to these challenges. And so, as you settle in to begin listening to our presenters, take note of the Q&A feature on your screen. After the presentations, we'll answer as many questions posted there during the presentations as possible. And so now please turn your attention to Ms. Jennifer Berkshire.
Thank you so much for that great introduction and for giving us a sense of the amazing panel that we're going to hear. I'm thrilled to be with you tonight. I'm joining you from Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is up north of Boston, but I'm originally from Illinois. I grew up in Springfield. I'm a proud product of District 186. My sister is a public school teacher in Southern Illinois, and I also graduated from Eastern Illinois University. Go Panthers. So if you are paying attention to Marie's description of what I'm going to be talking about, she laid out a number of questions, and frankly, they all sounded a little depressing, at least to me. So my goal tonight is to give you a sense of the big picture, but to try to do it in a way that doesn't leave you feeling absolutely despondent, because I do think that there are some little green shoots of hope out there. So I'm going to start just with a little story for you. As Marie mentioned, I co-host a education podcast called Have You Heard? And that means that I get to talk to just an enormous number of teachers and students. And I recently interviewed present and former students from a district that is really at the epicenter of the battles over critical race theory and really anything having to do with the discussions of race and racism in the classroom. They're in Southlake, Texas, which you may have heard about. And the student who I was interviewing described growing up in a community that was very white and where discussions of race were, they had all sorts of incidents with racism in the past. She felt like it was very difficult to get these acknowledged in the classroom. And when it was time to look for a place to go to college, she decided that she wanted to get as far away from her hometown as she could. So she sought out the most diverse school in the country, and that was DePaul University. So I just wanted to start by telling you that nice little story. And I bring up Southlake for a reason. I first learned about what was happening in Southlake years before the current wars really have broken out over what we would really think of as the anti-CRT backlash. A group of students reached out to me to talk about their efforts to make the district hold their district accountable for what they really saw as a culture of casual racism in the schools that made it very difficult for their peers to feel at home in the classroom and in the hallways. And they had tremendous success doing this. They put pressure on their school board, and the school board got to the point where they actually took measures to implement an equity plan that would require things like diversity training for teachers, etc. And that really was a big part of what spawned a backlash. At the time that began, people didn't even have the initial CRT in their vocabulary. Instead, they were just, they were unhappy about things like an equity plan and the word diversity. And I share that story with you because I think it's actually very typical that what we're seeing right now and what we're going to be hearing about from the other panelists, especially Dr. Bruno and the folks who are involved in the front lines of these school board fights is that these are actually the most current iterations of things that have been simmering for a while. That often when you dig a little deeper into the fights that seem to be brewing the hottest, these towns that keep hearing about in the news, what you discover is that, there were other things happening prior to the fights over CRT or masks. The districts were diversifying. Students were putting pressure on their teachers and district leaders to change the curriculum, to better prepare them for the world that they were entering. And often they were having success doing that. And then you add to that the intense polarization of the Trump era, the pandemic and its long fallout, and now what we see where we have this sort of the combination of all those things where hot button issues are now seen as the way for politicians to get elected, to get reelected, and you really have this atmosphere that is just explosive. So I tell you that, I give you the example of Southlake because I think that is so true of what we're seeing happening around the country. That what journalists often report as being a brand new story isn't a brand new story at all. In fact, it's very old. My co-host for my education podcast happens to be an education historian. Now, this was a field that as I was going to school, I didn't realize there was such a thing. I knew that people went to school and trained to become teachers, but I didn't realize that there were people who just studied education history. And it happens to be a really useful skill to have, in part because we see the same battles play out in the US over and over and over again, and then they're almost immediately forgotten about. And that is so absolutely true of what we're living through right now. So I want to take you on just a couple of little mini field trips that I think will kind of bring this to life so that we don't have to talk about education history in the abstract. So way back in 1974, there was a school board battle in West Virginia that actually puts what we're seeing now to shame. Parents there, a group of parents, were very concerned about what they saw as, frankly, disrespectful attitudes among students in the community. They complained about all the things we hear parents complain about. The kids were, they weren't paying enough, they weren't honoring their elders, their parents. They were swearing, they were smoking dope, they were engaged in public displays of affection, the things that parents have complained about for eons. And the parents decided that the fault for this really lay in the schools. And not just in the schools, but in a particular series of textbooks that they saw as anti-Christian, anti-white, and loaded with things that they saw as both multicultural and feminist, the hot button terms that were just starting to emerge in the 70s. You can easily read about this era and think that you are reading about the CRT battles right now because it all feels so familiar. But as I started learning about this earlier era, I noticed something really interesting. I noticed that a lot of the same groups and individuals that are so involved in fanning the flames of our current round of fights over curriculum and what teachers can and can't say in the classroom were right there for that battle too. And I'm thinking about a particular one. Some of you may have heard of the Heritage Foundation. Well, when things blew up in West Virginia, the Heritage Foundation, which was really pretty brand new, rushed to the scene to try to convince conservatives that this was the moment to abandon their public schools. Now, as I read about that, I was so struck by how familiar it feels. When Jack Schneider, who's my co-host and co-author of the book, we're finishing up our book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, we didn't know that there was going to be a pandemic. We didn't know that there was going to be a pandemic as we were writing it. And then as we were putting the last touches on it, and schools were just starting to close, we could already sense that these organizations and individuals that had agitated for so long against public schools really saw this as an opportunity. In those early days when schools first closed down, the Heritage Foundation put out a semi-official looking report. It was actually set up to look like a report that came from the White House, laying out the policy agenda that states should pursue as the pandemic unfolded. And they trotted out a lot of agenda items that they have backed forever. They would like to see teachers not be licensed. That would make them cheaper. That would make their unions weaker. They would like to see that instead of funding schools and school districts, that money go directly to parents who can spend it on whatever they want, including private religious education or education that doesn't come from a school at all, what they call learning options. It's an old vision. It comes from the first term of the Reagan era. But here was Heritage seeing an opportunity to really drive this agenda forward. And, they didn't know at the time that we were going to see this tremendous backlash against critical race theory. And so here you have them pivoting again in the current moment to really signal to politicians around the country that this is your moment. This is your opportunity. If you are someone who is opposed to public education for a whole long list of reasons, maybe you don't like the taxes that pay for it. Maybe you don't like the fact that it's compulsory. You don't believe that people should have to send their kids to school. Maybe you resent the fact that we have a separation of church and state. All of those things. Here's the signal that this is your opportunity, whether it's these wars that we see flaring at the school board level or the kind of disinformation about what it is that schools teach and kids learn. The Heritage and other groups are basically telling policymakers and political leaders, here's your chance to really convince your constituents that their public schools are the enemy, and here is how we're going to drive this agenda forward. The more I got interested in the history of this, the more I wanted to know, well, what happened in these other eras? What happened in the 70s? What happened in the 90s? I recently wrote a piece for the New Republic about the parents' rights movement in the 1990s. And there again, I was absolutely stunned to see that there was a movement that is like word for word ripped from the headlines of today. Once again, you had parents who were understandably anxious about all kinds of things. Just as parents today are exhausted and anxious after a pandemic that won't end and has too often, the responsibility for dealing with it is just put on them. Parents in the 90s were increasingly worried about the speed of cultural change. They felt that they were losing control over their kids, what their kids learned, and they, you had a lot of them who just wanted to sort of put the brakes on the Cultural Revolution. And so you really had a parents' rights movement take off. There was a concerted effort led by a lot of familiar groups and some names that you would recognize today. The name Betsy DeVos might be familiar. And the goal was to get on whether it was enshrined in the Constitution of every state or in the law books in every state. The goal was to get parents' rights language into the law so that there was no question that the responsibility for directing the education and upbringing of kids belongs to parents, not the state, and to nobody else. And this, for a while, it really seemed like it was going to go places. Pat Buchanan, who ran for president in '96, ran as the parents' rights crusader. There were efforts in all of these states to introduce these laws, just like today, where we see whether it's the education gag orders or now the curriculum transparency laws. So these things were popping up everywhere, and it really seemed like the movement couldn't fail. And then what happened is that it did. It ran out of steam for reasons that are very similar to what we're seeing today. something that sounds good in the abstract, like parents' rights, when people start to see that it actually translates into very specific policy demands. I don't want my child being exposed to this. I don't want this book in the library. I don't want this movie being shown at the local theater. It starts to make people more and more uncomfortable. And I think we're already seeing that in present day polling, that an issue that in the abstract polls very well, curriculum transparency, this latest push that schools and teachers and districts need to post everything that teachers teach online. Defined in the abstract, people think that, like, that's not a bad idea. Parents should be able to see what their kids are learning. But once that translates into a specific group of parents in Tennessee demanding, that graphic novel about the Holocaust be banned, or parents increasingly demanding that books about LGBTQ issues be banned, the movement starts to lose steam. The other thing that I think is really heartening about these lessons from the past is that we can find encouraging moments where political movements that seemed like there was no stopping them started to lose steam when unlikely groups of parents banded together. I'm thinking of Kansas in particular. I don't know if you're familiar with Kansas and its recent politics, but it was home to a bold, even audacious experiment in tax cutting. And basically they cut taxes down so low that they stopped being able to fund their schools. So within a relatively brief period of time, parents of all stripes started to see things like schools falling apart. There are not enough teachers. They're having to cut all sorts of extracurriculars. And what happened was that an ideological argument that had appealed to all sorts of people who would tell you in the abstract that they don't like paying taxes started to run out of steam when parents realized that their own kids' opportunities were actually being limited in order to realize this cause. And so what you started to see was what I hope we're starting to see today, which is the backlash against the backlash. That as parents begin to understand that these education gag orders that now apply to something like a third of kids across the country, that as they realize that that's going to impact their own children's ability to, say, take an AP class or get into college, you're going to start to see parents who have been quiet or sitting on the sidelines or not wanting to participate in that scrum at the school board meeting, feeling empowered to speak up because suddenly the interests of their own kids are now involved. And that's a lesson that we see again and again as we look back at history. Just this week, there was an important mini victory. I hesitate to call it a full victory because we don't know what's going to happen. But in Indiana, where lawmakers have just been particularly egregious about putting forward these ideological bills, whether it's banning the discussion of race and racism in the classroom, you've had moves to mandate cameras in the classroom so that parents can watch what their teachers are telling kids. And then the most recent flap was about a particularly expansive version of one of these curricular transparency bills that I've mentioned. And it really seemed like it was a shoo-in, given the explosiveness of the climate and how it seems that, all that conservatives have to do is nod to parent rights, and they can push these extreme pieces of legislation forward. But again, you saw a very interesting coalition of folks get together. You saw teachers who week after week made the case to the public and to lawmakers that having this kind of legislation on the books would make it much more difficult for them to do their jobs, but also to serve the kids of Indiana, the little Hoosiers. And then you had civil rights advocates, you had Black parents, you had community leaders saying, making the case that these kinds of bills are harmful to all kinds of kids, and that they limit the ability of a state like Indiana to move forward. And so that the latest bill foundered, it's been pronounced dead. I'm hoping that we will see a lot more of this. It's totally possible, given the reality of our politics right now, that legislators will figure out a way to sneak pieces of that bill back into other legislation. But I think it points us to yet another potential coalition of folks and a way to broaden the conversation about what's happening in our schools, because that is really the challenge before us. We're watching this tremendous backlash to progress play out around the country. It's disheartening, it's discouraging, but I think it's really important to recognize that in many ways, the ferocity of this push is a reflection of the fact that the lawmakers who are driving it recognize that they've already lost, that the way we acknowledge racism and its impact has already changed. They've seen the polling about the views of young people today. Young people are far more likely to be accepting of gays and lesbians than previous generations. They're far more likely to be worried about the impact of climate change. Go down the list of issues one after another, and you'll see that the conservatives who are so desperately trying to re-engineer young people to be young conservatives through the schools, they've already lost and they know it. And so our job as people who care about public schools, who care about the common good, as future teachers who are about to enter into this charged profession, is to figure out ways to keep those coalitions going and grow them, and to make the case to all kinds of people that those, whether it's those fights at the local school board, or whether it's a bill that a lawmaker has brought up that is just going to be a disaster, we need to talk to people who don't know about schools and why they matter so much. So I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you about this stuff. You can probably tell that it's something I'm really, really passionate about. But I do think it's so important that we both learn from history and also take heart from anything out there right now that's positive. And that's why I'm so excited to hear from somebody who is in the trenches right now. Dr. Bob Bruno has been battling at the school board level, and I'm betting that he has a lot of successes to share with us. So Bob, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. It's a genuine pleasure to join you, the other panelists, and all of my good friends at DePaul University. As was noted in the introduction, like many communities across the country, we had folks opposed to the steps our board at District 41 took to deliver a quality education during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that stretched into 3 school years. Before reviewing what happened in our elementary, pre-K through 8th grade district, it's worthwhile to properly set the scene at the dawning of the 2021 academic year. First, keep in mind that there wasn't a playbook for doing school when an invisible and little understood virus threatened the lives of individuals and the health of a community. School administrators were not licensed in infectious disease control, and school board members are citizen volunteers with no expertise to make pandemic level healthcare decisions. Let me read a passage from something I published on the subject that lays out a few of the confounding obstacles that boards faced at the onset of the pandemic. Schools across the state were confronted with a vexing problem: how to reopen safely while a highly contagious and deadly virus was still rampant. National health data showed that school-age kids, particularly elementary school-age kids, had fewer infections and were perhaps less likely to infect than older age groups, but the scientific information on the infectious rates among young people were conditional and preliminary at best. What would happen if Illinois opened the doors to 2 million public school kids? Schools that were on average over 40 years old, badly in need of air quality retrofitting, with narrow hallways and built to hold large groups in tight, intimate spaces. These schools were not designed for educating kids during a pandemic. Students and roughly 130,000 teachers, plus principals and non-certified staff in just under 4,000 schools, would have to be kept safe. Yet no one knew for certain how. And the ones who would have been expected to provide direction were not doing so. While the governor did issue several executive orders and state agencies provided in-depth guidance for mitigating virus spread, the state decided to let individual school districts determine the modality of instruction for their students. Further complicating matters for school board officials, the state's 102 county health departments played a passive role in school openings. Health departments were helpful and provided a blizzard of data on the virus, but none of it came with direction, and all of it was conditioned as guidance. In the absence of a robust health department role, school superintendents and school boards throughout the state had to make infectious disease mitigation decisions as a predicate for providing some type of instruction. Without an objective health standard, what was safe and how to determine it were subject to intense debate. Now, here is where understanding the role of school boards is essential to the story, and it's where I think my place on the panel comes from. School boards in Illinois formally function as a governing body under the authority of the state school code. As a governing body, they provide big picture direction and set performance parameters for the superintendent and her team to deliver education in the school district. Now, according to the Illinois Association of School Boards, local boards govern by executing 6 fundamental duties. Let me go through these. Number 1, the board clarifies the district's purpose. Now, this is the ends of the district. And 2 objectives are paramount: student learning, first and foremost, and then organizational effectiveness. The ends reflect the district's direction, its priorities, and desired outcomes. And these are recorded in statements of core values, beliefs, missions, vision, and goals. Number 2, the board connects with the community by understanding the community's educational aspirations. Engagement with parents should serve the broad public good rather than narrow special interest. It does not mean, however, using preference polling to select instructional material or decide district pedagogical practices. Number 3, the board employs and evaluates one person, the superintendent, and holds that person accountable for district performance. If the board is effectively governing, then along with the superintendent, they will develop one strong district voice and act as a team. Number 4, the board delegates authority to the superintendent to manage the district and provide leadership for the staff. For example, the board adopts state curriculum standards, but in the pursuit of meeting those standards, it does not determine the books kids read, how teachers teach, or the specific intervention a child needs. Those decisions are made by the professional educators in the district. Number 5, the board monitors progress towards meeting district ends by asking a series of questions. Are kids learning? Are they socially and emotionally growing? Are we creating an equitable, inclusive, safe, and welcoming space for all children and staff? Are we properly staffed and resourced? Are staff able to do meaningful work? Do we have a well thought out professional workday? Do we have a healthy work climate and culture? And finally, 6 and lastly, the board takes responsibility for itself and for speaking in one voice by following written policies to guide its operations, restricting its deliberations and actions to governance work, not staff work, investing then in professional development, and conducting regular self-evaluations. In summary, boards don't manage or direct staff or execute plans. They don't get involved in tactical or operational decisions and actions. Instead, boards act strategically by establishing district goals and missions and by measuring progress and compliance. School boards answer the question, what is to be done? The district answers the question, how is it to be done? Now back to our story. Before schools opened in 2020, District 41's board directed the administration to develop and implement a plan to maximize in-person learning and minimize health and safety risks. Over the next 2+ years, as health conditions and guidance changed, the board held fast to its directive and the administration altered its work in response to new scenarios. The COVID safety plan at District 41 included 14 mitigation measures, including being one of the first school districts in the state to adopt weekly surveillance testing for students and staff. We consulted with Yale University and infectious disease specialists, and we hired additional nursing staff as well as ran 6 vaccination clinics. We also provided instruction and student services in all subject areas in 3 different modalities. In each case, the district's approach followed the best educational insights and focused on grade level learning objectives to mitigate as much as possible any systemic unfinished learning. Despite the board's comprehensive strategy to educate and keep our people safe, masking, testing, vaccinations, and other assorted aspects of public schools, as Jennifer referenced, were in different degrees unpopular with some community members. And they expressed their dissatisfaction by holding protests, sending emails to the board, posting on social media sites, signing petitions, and speaking at board meetings. While often mischaracterizing district practices, misusing or not understanding educational or health data, and drifting into ad hominem attacks against school officials and board members, much of the public discourse was within the prevailing bounds of civic decorum. However, some of the communications and behaviors were uncivil, and the worst exhibited a binary mindset that deceptively used educating children as a device to divide people into good or evil tribes. Across the state, school boards and district staff had been subject to so many written, verbal, and physical threats from random individuals and organized groups that the Illinois Association of School Administrators and the Illinois Association of School Board Officials expressed concern for the welfare of local personnel and board members. When bad, disruptive, or threatening behavior occurred in our district, it was met with a measured and appropriate board response to protect students, staff, and other community members, and importantly, allow the district and board to conduct its business. Now, I imagine to an outside observer, responding to the chaos erupting in some district over COVID rules and educational efforts to address inequality and discrimination must have been perceived as the primary work of the board and schools. It was something that consumed a fair amount of time, but responding to a pandemic and its attendant collateral damage never disrupted or deterred the ability of schools to fulfill their mission. In our case, without exception, we executed our plan to maximize in-person learning and minimize the health risks. And as we eventually learned, District 41 kept school virus positivity rates near 0.5% and had students at every grade level perform above average on a nationally normed test. More incredibly, our model delivered the highest growth rate among our lowest performing students, and within 3 months, with 3 months left in the present academic year, our students are poised to return or even exceed their pre-pandemic level. Now, how in the world we did all of that while nonpartisan school boards were made the subject of political vilification is the subject of another time and presentation. However, in closing, I want to emphasize that if you plan to enter the education profession and care about a relevant 21st century public education, you need to be attentive and engage with your local school board. School boards in Illinois hold elections every 2 years. Typically 3 or 4 positions will be on the ballot, and in most cases, less than 20% of voters turn out to vote. Therefore, it only takes a few hundred votes in many districts to secure a board seat. Board meetings are also open to the public, where community members are afforded an opportunity to make public comment. Too often, meeting attendance is driven by matters that reside on the periphery of meaningful educational subjects instead of by the incredible work that lies at the heart of what public schools contribute to the development of young people and the stability of our constitutional republic and civil society. The English philosopher John Locke noted that a proper education allowed a child's natural talents to flourish by laying the first foundations of virtue. He went on to further claim about all people that, quote, 9 parts out of 10 are what they are, good or evil, useful or not, by their education. Now, I'm not sure of the ratio, but there's no doubt that learning is strongly associated with the quality of a person's existence. Since the early 20th century, when views of assembly line-like teaching, like teachers teaching scripted lessons competed with theories of experiential learning, to contemporary efforts to convert the educational sector into a competitive marketplace of buyers and sellers, public schools have been a fulcrum for intense national debate. Nonetheless, it is as true today as it was 100 years ago. An inclusive, created, ethical, and prosperous nation depends on a strong system of public education, and we'd be wise to protect it. Thank you all very much. And now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome our next panelist, Lane Peta.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruno. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel with such amazing fellow educators and people who care so much about education. My name is Lane Peta. Unfortunately, I feel the need to begin my portion of the panel with the following disclaimer. The opinions and ideas that I express here are completely my own and do not represent the school or school district where I am currently employed. The fact that I feel the need to even begin this way is indicative of the environment in which most public educators and public school librarians find themselves working at the moment. As I said before, my name is Lane Peta, and I am a librarian who currently works as a library learning center director in a suburban middle school. After 7 years of teaching high school social studies, I made the transition to full-time librarianship after receiving my master's degree at the University of Illinois. I believe deeply and passionately in the role of libraries in schools and in the public space. They are foundational to a healthy and prosperous democracy. A school library is a stepping stone for our youngest citizens. It teaches them to love to read first and foremost, to access and evaluate information, and to navigate the complex digital landscape in which they live. It also hopefully prepares them to be adults who will support the free and open access to public libraries and their collections for not just decades to come, but hopefully for as long as humanity exists on this planet. In the past 5 years, school libraries in particular have come under increased attack from both individuals and groups seeking to remove materials from their collections. When a book is banned, it usually means that it is removed from the school library shelves or is no longer used or allowed to be used in individual or group classroom lessons. The physical material is hopefully donated or recycled. The school librarian is tasked with creating a collection that is not only age and reading level appropriate for their particular student population, but also one that represents fully the population and community of students that they are serving. One of the ideas that informs modern school libraries is what many refer to as the mirrors, windows, and doors principle. That is to say that students should have access to fiction and nonfiction materials that reflect their experiences, that they have access to materials that give them a view into the lives and experiences of others, both past and present. And finally, that there are materials that allow them to engage in and gain empathy for experiences that they may not ever have real life access to. In the Chicago metropolitan area, books such as Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, Jack, Not Jackie by Erica Silverman, and Front Desk by Kelly Yang have been specifically targeted by groups seeking to remove titles from school library shelves and curriculum. Hot button issues right now are many that my fellow panelists have already spoken to or will speak to more specifically, including gender differences and gender dysphoria, LGBTQ rights and representation, racial issues. Anything that has a racial whatever to it is often tagged as someone teaching or promoting critical race theory, CRT. Police and law enforcement portrayals, anything that seems to empathize with the plight of those who are poor or undocumented. And finally, what is often referenced as comprehensive sexuality education, which has so many definitions, we could have a whole panel on that. Some schools and districts are being targeted with burdensome FOIA requests, seeking printouts, physical printouts of every single book owned at each school. Some schools are even suggesting having book review panels to pre-approve purchases and control which students have access to which books. There are well-funded and well-organized groups behind all of this. Some of them are No Left Turn, an organization here in Elmhurst is EPIC, which I'm sure my fellow panelist and colleague Lindsay will speak to, called EPIC, the Illinois Policy Institute, and not to mention individuals who publish lists of books to be targeted, like Texas State Representative Matt Krause, who compiled a list of 850 books he wishes to have reviewed by the state superintendent of schools in Texas. School librarians have been accused of providing pornography to students, both as a group and individually. These accusations starkly reveal the lack of understanding of the training and professionalism that it takes to build, organize, maintain, and promote a school library's collection. And it wrongfully and insultingly places librarians in the space of one of the favorite trigger words of the hour, indoctrinators. It also cruelly and erroneously supposes that librarians who serve children are supplying them with materials that could harm or somehow traumatize them. I cannot think of a characterization that is further from the truth. The very essence of a library and librarianship is to provide free and unfettered access to that which humanity has questioned and discovered through the ages. Librarians wish to inspire the world's peoples to move forward as a global organization of progress and increased understandings that lead to better outcomes for us all. Librarians, school librarians most especially, create and adhere to their collection development policies and student access policies to make certain that groups and individuals in turn adhere to the procedures required to ask for a title or resource to be reconsidered. This should involve a committee with representation from all stakeholder groups within a school, students most especially, teachers, librarians, administrators, and local community members. I think a First Amendment legal expert would be a great person to include on such a panel as well. No book or resource should ever be removed from a collection without going through this due process. It is the national and international standard. What can be done? I'm sure many of you are asking to be a successful combatant in the seemingly intractable cultural battle. Those who seek to remove books from school libraries and curriculums are organized, vocal, and seeing some success. As Ms. Berkshire referenced in her talk, the recent banning of Mouse, one of the all-time best-selling and considered to be one of the very first nonfiction graphic novels, which was removed from curriculum in a school district in Tennessee. Perfect example of organization and vocality seeing some success. However, those who are opposed to such acts of censorship need to do the same. There are many resources and toolkits available from organizations like the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom, the National Coalition Against Censorship, the ACLU, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Southern Poverty Law Center's education arm, which is known as Learning for Justice. School librarians need to have clear and collection development policies to know their collection inside and out and be prepared with a formal way for concerned parents or citizens to voice their opinions about materials in a civil manner. People need to know to show up to school board meetings and speak up and out, in the words of Dorothy Chisholm, against removing materials from shelves and therefore access to that item for everyone. The beauty of any library is that if you don't like what you are reading, you just return it. No questions asked. No subscriptions to cancel. As teachers and advocates for education, we need to be informed, ready, and eloquent in our approach to defending the types of stories that are challenged. This might mean working with colleagues, administrators, school board members, and community advisory groups within your school system. We need to include student voices in this task and conversation. Having students explain to adults who are in charge of educating both their minds and spirits what it means to have books, stories, and resources that reflect how they look, think, feel, and interact with the world around them could be one of the best tools we have for swaying decision makers and perhaps even whole communities. Also, reach out to your local, state, and national representatives. Tell them that you are a supporter of school libraries, their mission, and the books they're in. I believe that we suffer right now from a bad case of the silent majority. This can be remedied by getting organized and being loud in a passionate, eloquent, and informal manner. There are some specific questions that were presented to me in preparation for this event, and I don't have enough time to answer them all right now. I just want to end on a more positive note. We have the first line of defense and make sure that those mirrors, we have to be the first line of defense and make sure that those mirrors aren't shattered, the windows aren't barred, and the doors aren't locked for our students when it comes to what they have access to read and interact with. Recent national polling numbers show that nearly 80% of Americans reject the idea of book bans. A little bit of knowledge, a lot of passion and care, and the ability to communicate, advocate, and work together with students, parents, schools, and the larger community can surely turn the tide backwards to books for all instead of living a real Fahrenheit 451. Also, check out inspiring students who are doing things like a student named Kat, who has opened a clandestine library of banned books out of her school locker, or join one of the many student-led groups that are forming using public meeting spaces to have their own banned book clubs, wherein they read the books that have been banned in their area. Your students are always your best allies. And it is now my honor and pleasure to introduce Lindsay DiTomaso. I had the pleasure and honor to teach with Lindsay when I was a high school teacher, and she is now going to talk about her role in this subject. Lindsay?
Thank you so much, Lane, and thank you to everybody for being here tonight and your investment in public education and teaching truth. I really, really enjoyed listening to all of the good work Jennifer is doing and hearing all of the fights and battles and challenges that Robert is navigating just down the road. And of course, all of the good work Lane is doing as well as a librarian. I'm going to be a little bit more personal tonight as everybody has set the landscape since this has affected me as a social studies teacher. I have been teaching social studies since 1999. I did my undergraduate work at Miami University in Ohio, and of course earned my master's degree in educational leadership from DePaul. My love and passion is, of course, for US history. I also authored our first women's studies course at York High School, and I'm currently teaching American Studies Honors, which is our junior integrated US history class and English class. In addition, I teach AP government as well. So Lane, thank you so much for bringing up that poll today that came out on February 22nd. I will cite it again because it reminds me of what Jennifer said, is the tide starting to turn as we come together and start to organize against censorship. The poll Lane referenced is that 8 out of 10 Americans don't think books should be banned. That ran across racial lines, and it also ran across political lines as well. So when we finish tonight, it's really important that you leave, I think, feeling hope and feeling inspired. So we started to see this brewing, I think, last summer. Robert was talking about all of the things he had to navigate with COVID, and we ended our school year with half the students in person and half still on Zoom. And we made it to the finish line, and then we started to see and hear a lot about the stories of CRT over the summer. Ed Week has done a fantastic job covering this in public education, and I remember getting off the airplane in Nevada and having read a huge expose in Time magazine. And my radar started to district, probably like Lane's district and Robert's district as well, received a series of FOIA requests. The FOIA requests were for lists and lists of books. They were for certain words in our curriculum. They were for certain words in our syllabuses as well. And our department chairs in English and Social Studies handled those fine. And then when we returned to school, we were getting ready to for our open house, and everybody was really excited that we would be finally doing an in-person open house. And so my co-teacher and I were preparing for that. And as two humanities departments, it was important to us to have some sort of protocol in place should anything happen at open house, given the signals we had seen brewing in the community and with the national dialogue. So thank goodness in my district, I've been so well supported by my department chair and our administration and community members. But that was the very first open house ever in my teaching career, where we were interrupted by a parent multiple times, going after us and attacking an English novel that's taught to all of the juniors, asking about information on our syllabus that wasn't there. For example, I believe the language was some anti-racist assessment, which is not on our syllabus. And luckily we had procedures in place to keep us safe. Our department chairs were able to intervene the parent right away, and were able to provide a space for her to debrief and ask her questions about the curriculum. We came to find out the next day that this parent was an elected state rep. She is my elected state rep. So that has made this really, really complicated since August, knowing that as a constituent, your elected official is coming after your public education and the curriculum that you really, really believe in. After open house, we received a series of emails from 2 community members whose students I don't even have in class, questioning again what was being taught in the English department and the social studies department. The emails were consistent, they were threatening, they were bullying. And when we came across parent conferences in October, my co-teacher and I did have to have a dean and a school resource officer sit outside our classroom for a full 2 days for our safety. As things started to unfold, the best part about this, as scary as it sounds, again, is the support that I've received from our department chairs who believe wholeheartedly in our ISBE state standards for English and our ISBE state standards for the social studies. There was never at one moment where we were told to stop teaching what we have been teaching for 30 or 40 years, which is a comprehensive US history and English curriculum. But that didn't stop as our units went on, from the American Revolution to Western expansion to race and the American dream to even the unit we're finishing up right now on economic justice. We continue to get questioned for our curriculum. At one time, the state rep came to our school for a meeting, and there were 10 protesters in attendance during the school day, outside with signs that said education, not indoctrination. So it became really difficult to go into the classroom each day. You've all probably lived with a roommate at some point in your life. And it's started to feel like that bad roommate where you'd be scared to go in your safest place, your classroom, and not knowing what was on the other side or what sources were going to be distorted or what parts of the narrative or story or instruction would be left out. The final culminating part, if you will, was when a community member outed my name at a school board. You heard Robert talk about how difficult and oftentimes really scary. The public comment portion of the school board meetings have been over the couple of years. And I had a parent out my name and accuse me of being a Marxist in the classroom. The local press got a hold of the public comment, of course, and I believe my name's been published 8 times now in 8 different stories. And so that's where the professional turns personal. This is a community I have loved working in since 1999, and to not feel safe coming to your job anymore can be pretty daunting. Again, luckily, I've had wonderful support from my principal and from my department chairs. As hopefully you know, our 2 national unions, the AFT and NEA, have had very strong and very clear statements supporting a comprehensive U.S. history, education, and humanities. They've made very clear stances against censorship. So this became complicated with my union because they were very supportive of what we were doing. No one was telling us to stop teaching the state standards. There was no discipline, there was no contract violation or anything like that. So navigating the safety part became really tough. As time goes on, though, I also have that same hope that Jennifer brought up. Each day is getting better and better because you have to stick to your principles and you have to stick to truth, and that is teaching truth. Just today, this morning when I opened my email, we had an email from AP, which all AP teachers receive, usually weekly, from the College Board, and the title of the email said what AP stands for. And it brought me a lot of hope with their 3rd point. And I'm going to read this out loud from their email right now. And they say, if a school bans required topics from their AP courses, the AP program removes the AP designation from that course and its inclusion in the AP course ledger provided to colleges and universities. For example, the concepts of evolution are at the heart of college biology, and a course that neglects such concepts doesn't pass muster as AP biology. So like Jennifer, I really, really hope that the tide is starting to change. So what can you do, especially if you're going into education? One, you are so lucky to be teaching in a state with really strong state standards. One way I have remedied some of the challenges in the classroom is anytime I curate a source as a content expert, I do attach the social studies state standards, whether it's perspectives or the American dream or change and continuity over time. And I have found that to be really, really helpful. I would also read your contract, read the teacher's contract when you interview. I work in a district along with many others in the Western suburb that does have an academic freedom clause. I work in a district where our school board policies verbatim tell us we need to be teaching race relations and slavery and Civil War and Reconstruction. I would look at the curriculum as well. I believe that maybe it was Lane or Jennifer stated this, but lean on your PLCs, your professional learning communities. I'm so fortunate to be on an American Studies team where we curate our sources and our assessments together. So when it's time to approach your teaching, I think that one of the best things you might want to consider, of course, is that you're teaching about human beings. You're not teaching about heroes. And, going to school in the 90s, and especially my college education, that's when things started to turn. And we've seen a lot of our methods classes move us towards teaching outside of the corporate textbook, right? It's easy not to care if you don't know what's going on. And so human beings, all of us, living, dead, our policymakers, our presidents, our ordinary Americans, people who resisted, all come with assets and liabilities. So I really tried to derive my course from the American values, what those promised values were in our founding documents, and to what extent those founding values have been realized. If you feel like you're going into uncomfortable territory, I think one of the best things you can do in solidifying a particular concept, for example, is to illustrate that truth, those facts can be found in multiple sources. So for example, convention and who was present and who won the convention and whose rights and freedoms and ideas were being perpetuated at the convention. That is solidified in my corporate textbook. My corporate textbook says the same thing we did in the activity, that the merchants and the bankers and the Southern planters were able to solidify a constitution that benefited their needs. So we do have to address who was left behind, and we do have to look at those stories of ordinary Americans who have been fighting for those same values as our founding fathers, democracy and freedom and justice. So presenting the multiple sources is really important. The kids know. They are able to identify bias. They are able to look at an author's choices in constructing a text or constructing a film. And I would say that's an important one to lean on as well. We also always start our course with Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. And I would highly, highly recommend that among so many other sources, and getting the kids to think outside of their single story or their linear narrative that they might have of America and American history. So I'm feeling so empowered tonight to be with all of you. Those of you who are going into education, you are so needed right now, and you are going to be doing such good work right now, especially being a teacher shortage. We are here for you, and we are here to support you and train you and mentor you. And we are going to ride this wave as we have for so many times in history, as Jennifer brought up. So thank you so much. I'm looking at the clock, and I understand that we're going to transition into our Q&A time.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Yes, we are. So as you've all been sharing, people have been writing and wondering, asking all sorts of questions. And so I want to start with a question that's for all of you. And that is, what are you noticing are the effects of all this discord on the children, on the students? And for that matter, are the adults recognizing their role in causing any of the negative effects you've observed on them? It's open for everybody.
Well,
I just want to say that I think both from a curriculum standpoint and from the library standpoint, it is, I work in a predominantly white, upper middle class, wealthy community, but that doesn't mean that we don't have minority students, and that doesn't mean that the white kids at my school don't represent every type of person that exists in this world. And they are constantly seeking stories, because we as human beings love stories. That is the entertainment industry, whether it's music, videos, TV shows, video games, or books. And they want to be represented, and they want to see themselves. And when they hear adults screaming and yelling and being vicious about who they are, it does affect them. And I have had many times where kids have actually come to me and whispered to me about a type of book that they want, because they're afraid to say it out loud. And one of the things I always talk to those kids about is that you are never, ever ashamed of wanting to read a story about someone who is like you or someone who is different from you. And you should never feel the need to whisper something like that in the library. I find that to be one of the most ironic things that happens in a library in the situation we find ourselves in currently in education.
Thanks. Lindsay, you wanted to add something? Thanks,
Sure. Lane, thanks so much for talking about just stories in general. I think as we approach our curriculums, I know that we lead with the following questions, just to get the students thinking, especially since we're, I think across the board, all of our students are really I don't know the word, but we are really, phones are a big issue right now. And social media, of course, is a really big part of their life right now. And like Lane, I certainly feel an obligation to make sure that I'm teaching media literacy. So we usually try to lead with the questions of who's telling the story, who benefits from the story, and who's left out of the story. And when we keep bringing our students back to those questions throughout the year, it starts to allow them to identify their blind spots as well. So just last Friday, it was a teachable moment, of course, in the humanities, as we were watching the Ukraine and Russia war unfold in front of our eyes. By the afternoon, it was one of those moments where you had to stop what you were doing, and it was just time to teach. Our students are so fragile and vulnerable right now, coming off COVID in so many ways that people like Lane and I are not equipped to support, even though we do our best every single day. So it was a teachable moment to talk about social media, and that their TikTok feed had intentionally or not been consumed by images of the war all day. And luckily we were able to break that down and pull up the top 10 images that had that were falsely being posted on TikTok. They weren't fake images, but they were from different time periods or different wars. So that was a teachable moment as well. I think I strayed away from your question, Marie, but hopefully that helped a little bit.
Okay. Well, actually, a number of the questions coming in are related to, again, children's mental health. And one comes especially from our school counselors who are on tonight, as well as those who are studying to be school counselors. And they were wondering, they were saying how they're expected to speak to students all the time about topics such as bias-based bullying or the roots, as well as the impacts of generational trauma on, their students' mental health. And so they're curious, and maybe this is a question mostly for Bob and Lane and Lindsay, but certainly Jennifer chime in. So school counselors in attendance tonight are wondering, what have you heard about how book and curriculum content censorship is affecting how school counselors engage students in thinking and talking through these personally relevant issues? And for that matter, what can school counselors do about, any kind of pushback on being given access to children to be able to have these discussions that they know are so important to children's mental health? So who'd like to start?
Well, I'm happy to start, and what I will assert is that from the district's leadership and the board's perspective, we wanted our counselors to feel empowered. We wanted people like Lindsay and Lane to do good, courageous, creative work. They're professionals. And so we have set a tone that we are going to allow the professionals to do their work. And we will provide them with the resources and the support to do what they need to do. And where counselors feel they have to have these appropriate conversations, they are given the space and the support to do that. And that is true of our building leadership and the teachers within our school. And I think it's the best thing that district leadership and a board can do is to say, this is the standard that we are going to support, and we will be there to support and protect you and provide you resources to do your job as professionals. And quite frankly, the vast majority of parents have enormous regard for that classroom teacher, that librarian, that school social worker, and they feel comforted when they know that the district is supporting those professionals.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. I also think, to address your question, Marie, for our counselors, in addition to Robert's ideas for creating safe spaces, there's also so many safe spaces in our school through our extracurriculars. We are so fortunate in my district to have a Black Student Union Club. We have an As Is Club to support our LGBTQ plus population. I sponsor the Empower Club for Gender Equity. And counselors, I think that would be a really great opportunity when you're working with students who are struggling or need extra support, or really just a safe space of like-minded students to direct them to those areas. Right now in my district, that the sort of group that Lane was talking about, this parent group that has emerged, is currently going after our middle school LGBTQ club and the two teachers who sponsor that. But remember, these clubs meet before and after school. And this is a place where students can come together, especially in big, big buildings like in Glenbard and in Elmhurst. Our high schools are huge. They're 2,800 to 3,000 students. And so you might not always be in class with someone who's like-minded or shares your identity, or could just be somebody to build a relationship with. Lane?
I was gonna ask Jennifer, to speak to the idea that in addition to book banning, curriculum focused things about like race and those kinds of things, there's also a movement against SEL, which is social emotional learning. And the interesting thing about SEL is that it has come from both sides, that, there are more conservative leaning groups that are against it because I can't really articulate very well what their thing is, but there are some groups of parents of minority students who feel like it is repressive of kids' emotions and things of that sort. So maybe Jennifer could speak to that. That's more the what you would be dealing with as a counselor or social worker.
I think that's a really good question. And it's really sort of indicative of how quickly things started to morph. That, like first it was about critical race theory, but then you started hearing people also complaining about social and emotional learning, which it was a little bit harder to define. And, I think of SEL as something that the business community was really keen on, because they wanted kids to have the soft skills so that, when it was time for them to get their jobs at Amazon or Google, they would be able to collaborate and work in teams. So I thought it was very funny that that you see this sudden, push from conservatives who traditionally have been very keen on the idea that, that's the job of public schools, is to train future workers. And so, but you started to see, like somebody in Indiana would draw an image of a Trojan horse, and in the Trojan horse would be CRT on one leg and SEL on another leg. And it was basically, you always want to ask, like, well, what is the sort of like foundational thing that they're worried about? And that somehow schools are taking over the role of the parent in, sort of emotional development. And so that's why I think it pushes such a hot button. I haven't seen students responding to the attacks on social and emotional learning in particular, but I just wanted to throw out there that there's a walkout in Florida tomorrow inspired by this outrageous Don't Say Gay bill, which we didn't even get into. And, it basically includes all the worst of what we've been talking about, but then it adds this other element that is just so creepy, this kind of, like it encourages parents to sue schools, teachers, and school districts, and attaches a bounty to it. So like all the very worst things that you can think about attached to these very like emotional issues about kids developing. And I, as hard as this is, I do think that this moves us closer to the kind of backlash against the backlash. That when all of this started, so much of it was about schools and teachers, but now it's more and more apparent that who they're really going after is the kids. And it's the kids who are desperate to talk to the counselors that inspired this question that I've now given a very long answer to.
That's okay. Well, and actually what you were saying, Jennifer, is related to another question that came up in various ways just now. And by the way, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. They're getting funneled to me, so I ask our panelists, so please keep typing. Feel free. And this question is especially for Bob and for Jennifer. And the question is, so what do you consider are the valid rights of parents in terms of having influence over the content of their children's education?
Thank you, Marie. So, there is a obligation on the part of the district, and I noted it in one of those 6 fundamental duties that the school board has, to engage with the community, to be in partnership with the community. We know that when parents are involved in their children's education, all things being equal, the student is healthier, the student does better. And so we encourage families to be involved in their students' learning. But those parents, to the greatest extent, fully understand that curriculum decisions, pedagogical decisions, book choices, topics covered are in fact best decided by the professional educator, particularly that classroom teacher. Now, parents always are given an option. They're given an opportunity if they take to object, and if they decide that they do not want a child to be exposed to a certain topic, they are given some room to make that choice. But that's a choice made at the individual level. At the system level, the system is going to rely on the good work and the deep knowledge of its professionals. And if we do our work well, we will make the case for why you want your students to understand about racial inequality. You want to understand what gender inequality and misogyny is all about. You want to talk about inequality. You want to talk about the burdens that veterans might face or disabled Americans might face. You want, in other words, truth to be taught, because you want your children to grow up in a world where they can be creative, big thinking problem solvers. And if I could just put my University of Illinois hat on for just a second, when those children that Lindsay's working with and Lane is working with, when they get to a top tier, okay, so a little brag there, a top tier University of Illinois, and Lane is a University of Illinois graduate. So they get to a top tier Big Ten school like this. What we're going to find is those students who have been exposed to a broad base, small L, liberal education in which they are taught to understand what the world looks like in the 21st century. And that includes strong social and emotional intelligence. Those students are going to do incredibly well. They are going to put together very long-lasting and meaningful careers.
I'll just add one little thing to that. My co-author Jack Schneider and I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about parents' rights, and they gave it this incredibly clickbaity title: "Parents claim they have the right to shape their kids' school curriculum, period. They don't." And it ran the week before the Virginia governor's election, and I actually suspect that our piece may have tipped the election to Glenn Youngkin. I bear some responsibility for that. But the thing that so often gets lost in this conversation is that the reason that we have constraints on parents' rights is because kids have rights. And where the courts have been really queasy about this really, broad definition of parents' rights that we're hearing a lot about now is when, parents want to limit kids' access to exposure to particular ideas. And now what we're seeing a lot of is that they don't just want to limit their own kids' exposure to those ideas. They want to limit, whether, it's the whole community's exposure to those ideas. So when you read all these stories about parents' rights and you see people with their signs outside of a school board meeting, you always want to just ask, well, like, where are the kids' rights in all of that? Because we need to be thinking a little more about that.
A number of the questions, and actually some of them are actually comments more than questions, that have been coming into the chat are coming from those who are finishing up their degrees, aren't yet counselors, aren't yet teachers, and they're concerned and a little scared and nervous about what do they do when a parent says this or that, and how can they go about thinking through what their responses should be. Now, of course, certainly, we teach them, right? All, it's part of your teacher preparation program, your counselor preparation program. But as I'm sifting through these questions and comments that people are making, it's also, though, it's, you who have walked in these shoes are doing this work. You who are a board president, you who are, out there, Jennifer, talking with people, hearing, how people are coping as well as addressing and responding. Is there one thing that you can say, one piece of advice that you can give to pre-service counselors, pre-service educators right now to help them feel better about, okay, yeah, I am really ready. I'll be all right. Who wants to start? Tall order, I know.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. Of course, naturally, starting any new job, you're going to have concerns or be nervous or anxious about certain things. And I think you need to approach this that choosing an education profession also involves building strong relationships with parents and community members. Nothing you are doing in your classroom is illegal. Everything you are doing is supported by the state standards. And so there shouldn't be any caution in being proud of that syllabus or proud of your instructional materials. When we receive an email, and of course I've received emails prior to this year about a guest speaker or a particular source or a film, and I'm sure Lane's going to say the same thing. The very first thing I do is always consult my department chair as first of all to explain the situation and get some feedback. I think anytime you can bring that additional voice into the conversation, it's important. When I reply, I will always make sure that somebody is CC'd on the email, being it an administrator or my co-teacher, or anybody like that. So I think that is a really good first step. And remember to root your responses, if it's a curriculum issue, on the standards, right? I have pasted in the ISBE state standard. Sometimes people just need a little bit extra information. For example, in the English side junior year, the students read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And it's a book I'd recommend to everybody, but it is also a critique on the American dream from a Black American man, and for the same demographics of the community I work in that are comparable to Lane's, this really is challenging their single story of what it's like to grow up Black in America in Baltimore, for example. And so the parents want a little bit extra information. Yes, this is a critique of the American dream. We're going to spend time in class addressing what the American dream means to everybody, and what it might mean to you specifically, and what it means to people where it's not attainable, or what are we doing to move forward to make it more attainable. And then I'll go on to explain, guess what? Next semester, we're also reading The Great Gatsby, which is certainly one of our most classic novels on the American dream. And that is not a literary critique, whereas Ta-Nehisi Coates is. So I think that allows them to see with the one of the big things Robert brought up about having multiple perspectives in your classroom. And that, of course, is going to lead to the critical thinking piece. Lane, anything else from you, or?
I'm just thinking about the fact that, Lindsay, I'm sure that you would feel this way too. And Jennifer, I'm sure can speak to this as well. This is the end goal: scare people away from teaching. I wanted to be a teacher from a very young age. I come from a family of teachers and educators. The past nearly 3 school years have been the most difficult years of my life as a white, wealthy, cisgendered American woman. And it's not because of the pandemic. It's because of, I can't think of a better way of saying it than the title of Jennifer's book. There is a wolf at the gates, a story that connects the world, right? The idea of some scary unknown at our doorstep. And what I said in my little part was, you have to be ready. You have to be armed with information. You have to be able to speak eloquently. You need to be able to communicate in written form eloquently. You need to know who your allies are. And for me, my biggest thing is get the kids. Make sure that people you're working in a school where the kids' voices are always heard, that they are at school board meetings, that they are presenting to other teachers, administrators, other classes, that they feel comfortable saying, this is hurting me or this is helping me, and don't take it away from me. This stuff in Florida and Texas right now is a gut punch to kids who have seen in their lifetime gay marriage be approved by the Supreme Court, but now they have a state government telling them that their parents are going to be accused of child abuse if they let them wear a skirt and they're a boy. So, these are things that you need to be prepared to fight against, because teaching is still extremely rewarding. And whether it's in a daytime thing when you really make a connection with a kid, or it's 10 or 20 years later and an adult reaches out to you and says, that class, that lesson, that book, changed my life, helped me in a difficult time, stopped me from hurting myself, helped me reach out to this friend, made me prideful of who I am and what I stand for. Though that is why we teach that builds American community, citizenry, democracy, and a civil society.
Just a couple more. Sorry, who did I just interrupt? Was that Robert wanted to go? Go ahead.
Well, I think it was Jennifer actually, but
go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I'll be really brief because I'd like to hear what Lindsay, actually, I love just listening to to my panelists here, particularly what Lindsay and Lane are experiencing. What I was going to add was that I would say to this person in those really tough moments to really have confidence in that voice inside of you that drew you to education. Trust in that. It'll get you through. Teaching's never been easy. Right? Trust in that. It obviously isn't enough. You've got to have support. You got to have all of the infrastructure put in place, but trust in it, rely on it. And the second thing, and maybe this will seem particularly extraordinary, but embrace that moment when you're in front of that critic or that doubter. See it as an opportunity, frankly, to inform, to educate, possibly turn into a potential ally, because you are the most persuasive voice and you have a story to tell. And so have some confidence that the person in front of you, even though they're at the moment doubting and being critical, that they actually come to understand and respect what you're doing.
And Jennifer, we'd like to end with you if there was anything you wanted to add.
Well, I don't know how I could possibly top those rousing calls to action, just to agree with them. I think it's just, I'm so heartened by the fact that this turned out to be such an affirming and really inspirational session. Coming into this, I was really worried that, oh, they're future teachers. The last thing that we want to do is just go on and on about how terrible everything is. But, realistically, things are tough right now. And it's been just amazing to hear from people who are in the trenches doing such great work. I would just say that, to wrap up, in a lot of ways, this moment, we've seen it bring out the worst in people, but there are also plenty of examples where it's brought out the best in people. And, I've had the privilege of interviewing teachers around the country who are seeing this as the moment to really reach out and stand alongside that new teacher who has no protection, or those vulnerable kids who are worried that, these gag orders are gonna limit their options, or that a book that they counted on is going to be gone. And so I see those kinds of stories too. And that's what I really heard people talking about tonight. So I hope that people come away from this feeling a little more encouraged than maybe they started out.
Absolutely. And when you say bring out the best in people, one of the most meaningful things that happened to me this year after I was outed at the school board meeting was community members coming together and rallying around not me, but our curriculum. And I went to the school board meeting that night, shaking, standing next to the person who was sort of the perpetrator. And we had an alum from York High School who had organized an open letter to the school board supporting our curriculum and supporting critical thinking and different perspectives. And she single-handedly solicited 450 alumni signatures from graduates from 1970 all the way to 2021. And those are the little moments that you can use with your voice. You've heard that multiple times tonight, the power of your voice and the power of the pen. And you hold that power, especially being young and entering the profession. And I know even here tonight, I have a former student who is in his secondary English teaching class. And that always fills us up as well, as to hear all the good work that our students are doing that Robert mentioned in terms of their preparation to be an informed citizen in college and move us forward.
Well, I have the hard job of having to say, I've got to say goodbye. We've got to say goodbye because there are students here who are in class sessions with their professors, and their professors, I'm no doubt, are looking and saying, we were supposed to end at 7 o'clock. And yet I'm looking at these other comments and questions that are coming in. Of course, there are ones that we didn't get to, and I'm saying, oh, I wish we could have gotten to that one. But truly, on behalf of all of us at DePaul University, I want to especially thank our four panelists. And I also want to especially thank all of you who have come tonight. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions and your comments, but we're going to hold on to them. And there are threads through them that say to me, this is maybe our next forum. Maybe this is one of the forums we do really soon. And so again, on behalf of us, as I said, us all in the College of Ed, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. And we hope to see you at the spring forum. Take good care. And one last thing, because I will forget, and that is, you'll see there that there are resources. Meredith has been putting up resources for you to avail yourselves of. But of course, if you want more resources or you miss the resources somehow, please just get in touch with us and we'll be sure to get them to you. Again, thanks. Take good care.